Okay, thank you very much to everybody. So we welcome. You're here in Fondazione Enrico Mattei, in this beautiful place today. We have the honor to have here Professor Michael Spence. So Michael Spence will be with us. It's a very honor to have a professor here in our list of seminars. This is the economic model in seminars. So I remember to you that we started in December with Professor Robert Pindyck, and in the long list of our seminars is an honor, a pleasure to have here. We had also Professor Hill, Professor Zwart, Professor Toll in 2019, after we had also Professor Bergman, Professor Gollier, Van der Ploeg, Professor Gerlag, and the list continues with Professor Konduri, Professor William Nordhaus, and again Professor Pindyck during our conference of Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists in April. We started with Professor Metcalf, Stevens, and the last was before the break in summer of Professor Ekins, and we restarted now. With Professor Mendelssohn in October. We are retaking this. I remember that the economic model in seminars is organized by Fondazione Enrico Mattei, in which we are now. Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists and the University of Brescia, with a collaboration with European University Institute, Università di Siena, the Department of Environmental Science and Policy of University of Milan, and the Department of Economics and Management of University of Padua. The next event will be, we will start with Professor Killian, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas on February 2022, Professor Matiliski at February-March 2022, Professor Stern, March 2022, and also Shemzi, Professor at April 2022. And we are also arranging, Professor Rogoff accepted also to have our participation of our list of seminars. We have to define also the day. An advertisement about the Italian Association of Environmental Resource Economists. We are arranging the 10th Italian Association of Resource Economists annual conference, and also the first Mediterranean conference, again about environmental economists, and 21st and 23rd of April 2022 at the University of Cagliari. We have also opened the website launch. You can see here there is the link. It is possible to see on the website of our association. There is a list in order to have all the details about the conference that will be updated day by day when we have new information. Okay, today we start with Professor Spence. Now the title is Major Transformation Opportunities and Challenges. I remember it would be the professor is well known to everybody because a professor is very famous. Also, he won the Nobel Prize 2001 and the Nobel Prize in Economics. He is a professor and Dean Emeritus, Graduate School of Business and Stanford University. As I told you, 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics for his analysis of markets with asymmetric informations. In his topics, we have economic growth and development, economic policy in emerging markets, economic of information, especially because exactly on asymmetric information, impact on leadership and on economic growth. In his biography, it is very, very long. If you say I keep up some, I take only the most important, according to my opinion, but it's only my choice. Senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Philip Knight Professor and Dean of Stanford Business School, member of American Economic Association, fellow of American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Economic Society, and also long list of awards. Among them, there is also John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economic Association, David Wells Prize for the outstanding doctoral dissertation at Harvard University, and John Kenneth Galbraith Prize for excellence in teaching. Last point is on research. There's a long list of papers. I've quoted only, I've taken only the most important for us. So it's in the top ranking: American Economic Review, Econometrica, QJE, a review of economics and studies, journal economics literature, and journal economics perspective, among a very, very long list. There are also books. Books are creating and capturing value, leadership and growth, and the last was the next convergence, the future economic growth in multi-speed work. It will be more in line maybe with the presentation of today. I remember now the presentation today is the title is Major Transformation Opportunities and Challenges. I think it would be very, very interesting. An honor to have here Professor Spence. Only to give you the rule of our presentation. Presentation will be recorded, so we are also online with our platform. It's possible to have some questions during, maybe in general, at the end of the presentation for Professor Spence. At the end of the presentation, we finish more or less at the end of this hour, so 1 o'clock. And it's possible also to write some question in our platform if you want. So with Ilenia, that I thanks a lot, Julia, and all the staff that is here, and Martin, so organize all of this, we can start also to have some questions at the end of the presentation. So, and it's an honor, and I leave the floor now to Professor Spence.
Thank you, Sergio. Is this on? Is it on? Oh, good. So I've been away from the Fondazione for quite a while, but so it's nice to be back. You all are doing serious research, so I think of this as taking a break and sort of standing back and taking a look at what's going on in the world. I mean, I think it's serious and important stuff, but the things I'm going to cover, you know, each item, you know, would justify a semester course. And so you will find we're sort of touching somewhat lightly or selectively on these topics as we go along. But I do find it's useful, in part because these things are interconnected. So the only amendment I would make to what you said, Sergio, is if somebody wants to talk as I'm going along, just stick up your hand and we'll do it. Because I think it's much more interesting for you and for me if we do it interactively. Now I'm going to see if this works. So that's the title. Let me start with what I hope is just a brief sort of assessment of where we are right now. Because I always think the starting point makes a difference. And it's been a pretty rough couple of years, and it's maybe not over. So if I go back to the first half of this year, with some exceptions, if you think the universe is the global economy that we're talking about, we were in a pretty rapid recovery. Not surprising, you know, because the vaccines came in with slight asynchronicity, rolled out in the developed world and some of the higher middle income countries. So the first half looked pretty promising. By the time we got to September, you know, things were looking a little bit bleaker. It's not true that we're not still in recovery mode. That would be an overstatement. But we had a number of things that we were not anticipating. The Delta variant was a significant setback, not only in health terms, but it started to cause ports to close down and other things. We had, you know, an eye-opening summer on the climate, you know, severe climate event front, to the point where many people, I don't think this is documented yet, believe that we've arrived at the point where these events are now severe enough, global enough in coverage and whatnot to start to have serious macroeconomic events. When I was young, you know, there were famines and this and that. Occasionally a hurricane knocked out something, but it never really showed up, you know, in sort of overall measures of economic performance. I think that's about to change. You know, President Biden said 1/3 of Americans live in counties that experienced a damaging and sometimes life-threatening climate event. And the estimated cost thus far this year in dealing with what the IPCC warned us about in the summer, you know, what I thought was a marvelously blunt report, actually. It's $100 billion, and that's just the United States. And that's just an estimate, and that's the public sector cost, not the overall cost. So, so we, you know, we started to have headwinds. And then the other two things I wanted to mention, and I feel really strongly about this, so but I won't use up all the time on it. the vaccine rollout, when it got to a subset of the middle income countries and the lower income countries, is just stalled. So the estimated net vaccination rates in the lower income countries, particularly those to the south of us, are on the order of, between 5 and 10%, maybe even lower in some countries. This is a prescription for having Delta, what I used to call Delta 1, Delta 2, Delta 3, etc. And the solution to this, well, I'll tell you one other fact that may shock you if you haven't heard it already, which is the developed countries have options to buy, have either doses or options to buy vaccines in amounts that are in excess on the order of 1 billion doses, more than any conceivable estimate of what we collectively need if we do boosters and vaccinate everybody over the age of 2. And what that means is COVAX and the other entities that collectively represent the lower income countries can't buy the vaccines because they've already been, purchased. And what we need to do, there's a lot of talk about intellectual property and whatnot. I personally don't think that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to release the options or exercise them, spend about 3 or 4, or maybe even $500 billion and ship the doses to the rest of the world and stop this now. But it's not happening. It's one of the great disappointments. This, compared to the climate challenge, which is so complex, it's mind-boggling. This is simple, right? It costs about, the benefit cost analysis looks like this. And let's say it costs $500 billion, right? Half a trillion. The estimated monthly cost to the global economy of the contraction that we experienced in 2020 was that number every month. Every month, okay? So the cost of not having the pandemic under control is running up into the trillions of dollars. And secondly, we don't have to do this, as an act of, humanitarian generosity or charity. We're doing it because that stuff will just keep coming back to the rest of us all over the world. So I can't for the life of me figure out, I and a lot of other people have been trying to break through this impasse, but so far, it hasn't happened. The big surprise was the supply chain congestion. This is a subject that fascinates me because I tend to like things that are sort of complex systems and figure out why they do and don't work. So let me just spend a minute on that. The demand surge was not a surprise. Olivier Blanchard and Larry Summers and a whole bunch of people told us we were going to have, they said it's an inflation problem. But we had accumulated savings because people couldn't spend the money. We had pent up demand, same idea. We had huge fiscal programs in the countries, mainly the developed ones, they were the right policies. We've run up public sector debt, but we did it for the right reason, which is not leaving that balance sheet damage in the household sector and the corporate sector, letting businesses fail and households struggle to, make ends meet as they got furloughed or laid off and so on. No question about that. And finally, monetary policy continued to be highly accommodative, so we flooded the system with liquidity. So we knew there was a demand surge coming. The thing that surprised us is that we thought this, the global supply chains were sort of highly efficient and very agile. Well, they're not. And so we have right now, backlogs, shortages of absolutely virtually everything, actually. Try going out and ordering something. Semiconductors in particular, which now are part of virtually everything that's physical product. And this is now expected to last well into 2022. So the claim that we have a transitory imbalance in the global economy is probably still correct. The question is, what's the definition of transitory? Okay. And it's starting to look longer and longer. And if we get a few more variants, it'll keep getting extended out. And you'll see in the commentary from central banks and others who have to monitor, in detail the performance of the economy. You are seeing this start to appear. as a result of that, we have, an uncomfortable, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not the subject for today, but I mean, there is inflation that's quite high. The issue is it's transitory, and the uncomfortable problem that central banks have is to try to decide what to do about it. That's complicated because we've run up a lot of sovereign debt. I'll show you. No, I'll show you that one in a minute. We have a significant global increase in public sector debt. That is a direct result of the pandemic. That means we're a little bit more shock prone, and in places that are at relatively high debt levels, including this country, there might be significant, fiscal consequences of a substantial increase in interest rates. And a fair amount of this debt is short-term debt as well. So the central banks are sitting there saying, geez, we have a temporary demand supply imbalance, which, by the way, we haven't had for 10 years, right? We operated essentially with a demand constrained economy since the great financial crisis and follow-on crises. And almost overnight, meaning this summer, when the supply chain, shortages started to show up, we flipped to an economy characterized by excess demand, which is where the inflationary pressures, the proximate cause of the inflationary pressures are coming from. And so the central banks are sitting there. Well, do we want to put the fiscal, balance in jeopardy? Do we want to lose our credibility by, sitting around watching inflation run? I guess you can think about that, and if you want to talk about it, I'd be delighted. But I'm awfully glad I'm not a central banker. I guess the short version of that. This is a picture. I just found it on the internet. There's somebody keeps track of flood events globally. This is this year, January to September, I think. I don't have much to say about it, except you can see it's global. I mean, it's very striking what's going on. So that's it for the preamble. Bottom line is we're in a pretty complex situation, just emerging from the pandemic. But underneath that, and this is the thing I really wanted to talk about today, a little bit anyway, maybe skimming across the surface, is underneath this are sort of longer term events that are really important. And I call them major transitions. And so I'll flip to that now. And I mean, this is arbitrary, right? I mean, and there are lots of things you could, suggest by way of adding to the list. But the four that I think capture a good deal of what's going on in the world are the shift of the global economy center of gravity to Asia, which has just a nearly infinite list of consequences: where technologies develop, where final markets are, who has economic power, how the global economy gets re-put together, who are the major players in negotiating the terms and conditions of the new rules of the game. That's, major source of global tensions now, because, if the United States and China don't trust each other, then they can't afford to fall behind in technological terms. I would say in the United States right now, foreign policy has gone from having a significant economic component to being essentially entirely dominated by the national security agenda and considerations. So economics, and things related to it have just simply been shunted aside. So that's one. Again, I'm going to be guided by you in terms of what you want to talk about. The second one everybody knows about is the digital, it's multidimensional, digital transformation of our economies. I think a lot of people think we're well along on this. I don't. I think we're in the early stages for a number of reasons I'd be happy to talk about. But there's a difference between what's possible and what's actually happened. So if you look at sectors in advanced economies, you'll discover there are sectors like finance and the tech sectors are pretty advanced in terms of implementation of known existing digital technologies, but then there's a whole bunch of lagging sectors. One of the things I believe, this is controversial, and lots of people would argue against it, is that when this pattern of the spreading of the adoption of these technologies occur, we could very well get an enormous burst of productivity again. Now, that's speculation, so you don't invest your children's savings based on that. This digital transformation has been dramatically accelerated in the pandemic. The leaders in these fields, say that somewhat casually, but they say, well, we had 10 or 5 years of adoption in 3 months. Why? Because we had to, right? I mean, you all know about working from home and all that, teaching remotely. These aren't perfect substitutes for what we were doing before, but they will become complements, and we will have hybrid models. But in behavioral terms, what happened is that the normal disinclination that people have and institutions have to conduct experiments is simply overridden in conditions like this. And so they conduct experiments, not all of them succeed, but the ones that do succeed then get adopted. And my favorite example comes from the healthcare area, because there's just big potential in telehealth, home diagnostics, and a whole lot of other things. But that's a very conservative set of sectors. So I have friends in the private equity world. They had a company that was doing very well doing scheduling of appointments in the healthcare area. And then at some point they thought, well, we know this sector pretty well. Now let's see if we can move into the telehealth area. So they developed some technology to do that and went out to sell it. Pre-pandemic, zero interest, right? Demand side and the supply side. I'm going to the emergency room. I'm going to my doctor. I want to see my patients. I'm not going to look at them on a screen. And then that changed instantly, overnight. And now it's growing like a weed, like a lot of other things that you know about, Zoom, etc. So that's the second one. And it is very complicated and presents challenges as well as huge opportunities. I'll try to talk briefly about them, but first I'm going to talk about the tools that are driving them. The third one is less discussed, but I think it's important. It's just there is a real revolution in biomedical science, anything to do with biology, medicine, health, agricultural science, and so on. Again, these are controversial subjects because one of the powerful tools I'll show you is gene editing. And the last one is the one you spend all your time with, so I won't bore you. But I will, I'm going to come back at the end and tell you what I'm thinking about that. So I'm not going to ignore the subject at all. But anyway, so those are the transformations. They are extraordinarily complex, and they're occurring simultaneously and rapidly. So I mentioned the burst of productivity. I think this is one good outcome. A second that you may or may not have spent a lot of time on, but these technologies, once they're fully developed, create enormous opportunities for inclusive, what I call inclusive growth patterns. But I don't just mean economic growth. So it is true that e-commerce has turned out to be, in studies, done in multiple countries, a kind of inclusive thing. Basically, the underlying idea is these technologies, even if they're not perfect substitutes for being in a dense urban center with all kinds of services around you, a very large fraction of the world's population does not live in centers like this, right? And you can deliver education and health and other things, not perfectly, but better than nothing, and using these technologies. So I think this is one of the most promising, when you kind of looked at it globally, one of the most promising aspects of the development of the digital technology. Some of them are quite sophisticated. So for example, using algorithms, artificial intelligence, and a very, very large batches of data, you can do a credible job of credit scoring and lend money to people who are simply blocked out of the traditional systems, right? No collateral. These studies have been done in China and other places. In fact, in China, they're kind of in the leadership position on this. Now, it has to be regulated. I mean, you got to be careful with the management, very careful with the management of data and avoiding, treating it, security, misuse, not selling it to the wrong people, etc. So all of that's true and is an important element of both research and policy. But it's quite remarkable. There's a bank that's powered by artificial intelligence in China that's able to lend companies that have 5 or fewer employees. There's millions of them, millions. 5 or fewer employees, no collateral, no real track record with a bank, nothing, right? In India, you're going to see the same thing, and they've created a biometrically based digital identification system so that essentially you remember, in these countries, not everybody has a birth certificate, right? And and an ID card, a carta sanitaria, and an ID card, and so on. They don't have an identity. If you don't have an identity, you can't have a bank account, right? So we don't know who you are. But it sounds sort of basic, and it is, but it's also incredibly important. On the challenge side, all of these disruptions are, including the one you spend all your time on, are extremely disruptive, and there are winners and losers. And one of the things I think you probably believe strongly, and I certainly do, regardless of which transformation you're talking about, is if you ignore the distributional consequences of these transformations, then you will start to encounter resistance and start to lose the benefits as well. We did that with globalization. I mean, certainly in America we did it. We just simply said, well, the net benefits are positive. We can compensate the losers if we have to. There's no practical way to compensate the losers, to be perfectly frank with you. And now we have one component of the underpinning of the resistance and polarization, economic, social, and political now polarization that we experience. And if you want to govern, you don't want to govern in a circumstance like that while everybody's at each other's throats. I mean, I think this is really, I don't want to overstate it, but I mean, it's really serious. You can get consumed with the particular challenge, whatever it is, but ignoring the distributional aspects of it is a prescription for, overstating it, driving your car into a brick wall. This is just an observation, but I think we're not very far away, maybe 10 or 15 years from having virtually all manufacturing and things like it become automated, meaning they won't be labor intensive anymore. That doesn't mean there'll be nobody anywhere near the robots, but it means it will not be an employment engine. And I mean this not just, in Italy or Europe or the United States, I mean everywhere. This is a huge challenge in the developing countries because the classic growth model, high-speed growth model that has worked in the post-war period is the starting point, right? The early stages of that growth, very high growth, are driven by leveraging the global economy's technology and demand and entering the global economy via the labor-intensive process-oriented manufacturing and assembly. That's going to get taken over, but there's no, and I think the cost characteristics of technologies. They're sort of high fixed, high development costs, relatively low marginal costs. If it's software, the replication cost is zero. It's like data, and so the costs come down with scale, right? And eventually, it really doesn't matter. What the alternative is, it'll beat it in the end. So we're not there yet, but we're not. We have the tools now. The essential tool is artificial intelligence, and I think you're all aware of what the breakthrough in that occurred in the last, not theoretically. I mean, the theory of neural networks and deep learning algorithms been around, but we didn't have the data or the computing power to implement them, and now we do, because the internet's fast and everything's digital data, and so if you want to teach a machine how to recognize images, which is something that you cannot program. You can't. I mean, I try to give people examples of this. You know, if you were sent out of here and the task was to write a piece of software that would enable a machine with some kind of sight or just images to recognize a cat, you couldn't write the software, and that's not how they learn to recognize a cat. The way they learn to recognize a cat is by pattern recognition and looking at literally tens of thousands, even millions of images, and so it's anyway. That's what it is, and it is the core. That's not the only thing. Dexterity, sensors that give it a kind of capacity to sense the environment and so on. I mean, you can see this all in autonomous in vehicles, for example, which are not there yet, but they will be. This has enormous consequences, this kind of thing, just this one. I mean, reconfiguration of global supply chains, completely different employment engines in the global economy, probably localization, because global supply chains for years have been built on the principle that if the least mobile factor of production, which is labor, can't move, then you take the economic activity there, right? In manufacturing, that won't be a constraint anymore. And then, of course, we talk incessantly, and not always sensibly, about jobs and skills. It's not that that's not an issue. It is. We're going to have different jobs and different skills. I think the popular discussion of it has gotten more sensible, but people think this is all automation. I mean, automation means removing parts of jobs or whole jobs. And of course, that's an element of it. I just described one. But the other part of it is what's come to be called augmentation. It means we all work beside machines. Now, that's not an unfamiliar concept. You do it all the time. When I was a young academic, we didn't have a computer. We barely were able to type, etc. So this is just the kind of turbocharged extension of what we're all used to, and the younger generation, namely most of you, has lived in the kind of digital world, all your life. So this probably doesn't even seem particularly revolutionary. So now I hope this is fun for you, but I just occasionally stand back and say, well, what's powering all this? I mean, why is this actually happening? And the answer is there's really powerful tools and technologies that are available. Some of them have been in principle available for some time, but so it's not just that they exist, but they become ubiquitous and low cost and highly accessible. In the case of artificial intelligence algorithms, for example, it doesn't help if Google has a bunch of proprietary algorithms that nobody else can use. But and that might have been a good description of the world when they were developing search engines based on these principles. But that's not the situation now. So a lot of these are in the kind of open source environment, and the costs are very striking. So anyway, here's my list. This is, by the way, this was the shifting of the center of gravity of the global economy. You can stare at this slide, but the developing world is bigger. India isn't anywhere near its full potential in terms of economic size and growth, with a population of comparable to China, 1.4 billion people. So unless something catastrophic happens, we're going to have two economic giants rather than one. And I'll come back to this when we talk a little bit about the challenge that you all deal with in the climate area. The leading semiconductor company in the world, probably technologically now, is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's quite a remarkable story, actually, but I won't bore you with it. But I bet if I asked you where's the leading semiconductor firm in the world and you didn't know, you probably wouldn't have guessed Taiwan. Anyway, this is a kind of historical product map, and what this depicts is the density of transistors on a semiconductor chip. You might say, well, why do I care? Well, the difference between the laptop that you used when you first had one and the thing in your pocket is this, right? So those of you who own an iPhone, you will be. Does this have a pointer? The red thing?
Yes.
Then you're here right now at 5 nanometers distance between the semiconductors. In another couple of years, the next time you buy your iPhone, you'll be here. Then there's a number on top of that. And I didn't know what it was when I first looked at this picture. The number where we are now at 5 nanometers is 171. Does anybody know what that is? Okay, and then I will tell you. It's that 171 is 171 million transistors per square millimeter on the chip. So a chip, that you can actually see has billions of transistors on it. It's a supercomputer, right? They're very low energy consumption. They're a critical part of the energy transition that we're about to make, and they're extremely powerful. I mean, they're getting to the point. Well, we're obviously going to run out of space here at some point, meaning this can't go to zero. But you can do artificial intelligence type, computing calculations on very small devices, even handheld devices like your phone. This is also artificial intelligence. There are 2 or 3 entities that are really in the avant-garde of developing artificial intelligence applications. One of them is DeepMind. It's based in London. It was at some point acquired by Alphabet, meaning Google, but it's pretty independent, and they're kind of pushing the state of the art. They're the ones who developed the algorithms that won chess championships and eventually beat the world's leading player of the game of Go, and so on. All of that's sort of cute, but this one I like. So this algorithm is relatively recently developed by them, set of algorithms, tools, I'll call them. And what they do is they take the amino acid sequence that defines a protein and forecast. These are forecasting. Artificial intelligence makes predictions, essentially. They predict with reasonable accuracy the 3-dimensional structure of that protein. Now that for those of us, in other fields, this doesn't make a difference. This is an enormous productivity booster for people in biomedical science, right? Because they spend weeks, even months, trying to figure out what the 3-dimensional structure of a protein is in order to determine its binding characteristics, whether, so this is crucial when you're developing vaccines or drugs, therapeutics of a whole variety of kinds. This just comes from the press, but there's a scientist in the United Kingdom who was trying to figure out to produce enzymes that would break down non-biodegradable plastics. And part of his problem was exactly figuring out which ones would bind and eventually undo the plastics, the molecules in the plastics. And he heard about this, and so he phoned them up. And he said, would you like to help? And they said, certainly. And so they conducted the following experiment. He sent them 7 amino acid sequences, of which 2 he already knew the 3-dimensional structure on Thursday. The next Monday, he got the AI prediction for all 7 back, and the 2 that he knew were right. So just, you can see how much this might accelerate productivity in this very special but rather important area. What happened there? Oh, here we go. The cloud computing everybody knows about. It is fairly important because it means everybody has access to the kind of full panoply of data and computing services, regardless of scale. I mean, you can start small and then it just scales with you. And eventually, you need this kind of capability to handle things like peak load problems. So I'm sure almost all of us have had the experience of having our bank be overloaded by transactions and sort of go out of business for a while on the internet. It doesn't happen when it's backed properly by this kind of system. The data I put on the left, I won't belabor, but I mean, it's quite interesting. So there's the equivalent of Black Friday in China is called Singles Day or 11/11. It's, never mind where it comes from. And it's, as a marketing device, Alibaba and the other, big mega platform e-commerce companies, but starting with Alibaba, turned it into a kind of their Black Friday. And because there's a lot of people on the internet doing e-commerce, the volumes are enormous. So when this thing starts at midnight, and at the peak, which occurs somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. in the morning, I guess there's people who stay up to buy stuff, at that hour, they're processing, and I give you the numbers here, on the order of 300,000 transactions and purchases a second, flowing into the system and not bringing it down. By the way, just on that subject, I think it's important. One of the important agenda items in the European Union should be to build a really bulletproof domestic cloud computing system. Because right now the big ones, like the mega platforms, they tended to develop as a side part of the mega platforms, right? Because Amazon has a similar surge problem, and now they have an enormously profitable business called Amazon Web Services, which is essentially a cloud computing system that sells, computing and data storage capacity to anybody who wants it. This is not one of the mega trends that I mentioned, but because it's related to digital, I thought I'd show it to you. There is a startling kind of explosion of entrepreneurial activity around the world. It wasn't very long ago that, your sense would be that the important, at least in the tech areas, that the important, sort of entrepreneurial activity was in a relatively small number of places, not one, not just Silicon Valley, but not spread like butter. This is changing very rapidly. So you have entrepreneurial activity in virtually every continent, and you have a spreading of the sort of ecosystems that support entrepreneurial activity. It's not everywhere. There's places that are out ahead and places that are, but it's quite, startling. And what this is everybody knows what a unicorn is. It's a company that relatively quickly gets to a market cap, regardless of whether it's publicly traded or not, of $1 billion or more. And so you can see, this is a little out of date now, but you can see that there's unicorns popping up all over the place, prominently in the United States and China, but also in India. There's a lot of them in Europe. There's a growing number in Latin America, right? And you'll also see they tend to pop up first in the large markets. And so let me remind you something I just said, which is because these things scale, so easily once they're, an attractive and market viable technology develops, the potential is biggest in the very large markets. One of the things we talked about in the last 2 days with some people I was with is why this might be important in Europe in terms of integrating the markets, because Europe in the aggregate is probably at the moment the biggest market in the world. Now eventually China will overtake all of us, and then India will follow along and do the same thing. But if you do create this very big market, then you create a kind of playing field for these kinds of technology solutions and so on that become increasingly attractive as investment opportunities, for people, the larger the market is. Right? This doesn't mean you have to have a big market. There's startups in Australia, which isn't all that big, and even Canada, where I grew up, it's not all that big. But in terms of the kind of mass, the aggregate, the attracting of all the things it takes to put all this together, market-driven things, you know, the big market is a distinct advantage. And here's another cut on it that just, again, I won't spend it. On the right-hand side, it's quite interesting. A fairly large fraction of these things are now in the fintech area. This is kind of mobile payments, you know, automated online credit. But one thing I didn't mention is it not only can you do this, let's take the credit example, and serve underserved populations who are kind of anonymous or kind of blocked away, or it's not economic to deal with them given the cost structures. But it happens very fast. So the Chinese always have a phrase for something, you know, common prosperity if they have a problem with equality and so on. The phrase they use in this bank that serves the small businesses is 310. 3 is 3 minutes to fill out the form. You know, 1 is 1 second to assess it and decide whether the credit's going to be extended, and 0 is the end result, right? So so in a matter of minutes you can extend credit on a pretty competent basis. This is DNA with sequencing, so probably this cost, you know, astronomical amounts the first time we did it. Why did I put this on the thing? Because DNA sequencing is a core tool in virtually all, not all, but a very large fraction. So the Omicron virus was sequenced in a matter of hours after it was first discovered, right? We would have been flying blind, you know, without it. We wouldn't, you know, 20 years ago, we would have no idea what this thing was, or whether it was different, or whether it was going to be, you know, resistant to vaccines. So DNA sequencing is important, and what this graph shows you is that the costs have not only plunged, but it have followed a Moore's law-like pattern, which is the way semiconductor costs or densities proceeded, and then it fell even faster. And so now we're down at about $1,000 per sequence, and it'll probably go down to another 500. I mean, I don't really know, but you can see that something that's critical in this part of the world has become highly affordable, and therefore, you know, a kind of ubiquitously available tool for people. This is gene editing. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but there's a not very well written but really fascinating book written by Walter Isaacson. I hope you didn't hear what I just said, but not well written. It wanders around a bit, and it's called The Code Breaker, and it's about the discovery of gene editing. And the picture there is the 2 women who won the Nobel Prize, I think 2 years ago. It was either 2018 or it was just before the pandemic, for their critical in chemistry, for their critical contributions to this. They're usually, these are the 2 that are usually credited with figuring out how to do this. It wasn't an engineering problem. Actually, they were studying bacteria, which are routinely apparently attacked by viruses. Bacteria had learned how to gene edit as part of their defense mechanism. They cut up the virus and put part of it in their own DNA sequence. It's kind of like a library, so they could recognize it when it came again. And then because they could cut it up, they also figured out that they could cut it up and neutralize it. and so they figured out how bacteria did that. And that's how we learned how to edit genes, apparently. Anyway, this one really makes people nervous. All of these technologies, this is probably the right time to say it, have enormously powerful positive uses and some significant dangers associated with them. And this would be the classic example. I mean, there's lots of very dangerous ways to use this. And that's not an uncommon idea. In Europe, there's a considerable amount of resistance to, which I understand, to genetically modified anything. And this is genetically modifying stuff. The promise, of course, is that you can cure genetically based diseases or genetically based proclivities, ranging from various kinds of cancer to dementia to a whole lot of other things. So it's not going to go away, but it's there. This is the cost of solar. And what we were talking about before, I was talking with Sergio and Elenia about it. This is for countries that have low cost of capital. This is a capital intensive technology. And the wonderful thing is that it's become more than competitive with fossil fuels set in the right environment, right? I mean, you all know better than I do that it's not totally reliable and you need a pretty smart grid to take full advantage of it. But the thing I wanted to say is because it's capital intensive, its economic characteristics are a function of the cost of capital. So if you go to places where the cost of capital, for whatever reason, is high, and it tends to be high in lower income countries, it may not be economically viable. And so the thought that many of these countries are going to build most of their electric generating capacity in the future, not have to convert the stuff they all have now, because they don't have that much stuff now, is a good idea. But then there's some work to do for the international financial institutions and the whole financial system to intervene in such a way that the costs of capital are brought down, maybe with guarantees or other things, so that obstacle to going down that road is removed. I guess I'm now at climate change. So can I keep going for a little bit? Okay. So I'm sure you've seen this, more than several thousand times. So it's not that I'm trying to tell you anything you don't know. I just want to highlight that China is, a very big player. Most of the increment now is coming from the developing world, and India isn't anywhere near where it's going to be when it gets further down the growth process. So we're at, close to 40 billion tons a year. That's fairly far away from 14 or something like that, where we would be, if not safe, at least, closer to where we need to be. This, by the way, is gross production-based emissions from fossil fuels. So not adjusted for consumption, no netting out of, the mechanisms that take carbon dioxide out. So it's not a complete picture. This is not peaked. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Well, it's really this. So the reason this is such an enormous challenge at this kind of gross macroeconomic level is that it isn't a matter of reducing the carbon intensity of a relatively stable in terms of size global economy. It's reducing the carbon footprint in an economy that has an enormous amount of growth still to go. And that, more than doubles the kind of magnitude of the challenge. In terms of peaking, the developed world is peaked. I mean, Europe was always below the other developed countries, especially the United States and Canada and Australia, in per capita emissions, and that's good. And then Europe is in the lead. And while America is coming down, finally, I think our high water mark was 22 tons a person, which is kind of embarrassing. Now we're down around 17, maybe a little lower. Europe was, at the time I started looking at it, was around 10, and some variation, considerable, like France was low because of the nuclear energy component. China, I think this is true because I was just talking a couple of weeks ago with friends who are deeply involved in researching this, but they believe China will peak as predicted by 2030, and they kind of hoped before. So, and I think that's plausible because of where China is in the kind of growth and development process. It's a high middle income country. There's a lot of growth left. I mean, they'll probably double the per capita income in the next 10 to 15 years. But it's the higher income part where the energy intensity of the economy naturally comes down. So You all probably know more about the details of this, but I find this a plausible prediction. On the other hand, India, for the same reason that, you know, from the previous graph, because of the enormous amount of growth, isn't anywhere near peaking. And I'm only guessing that it will probably, unless there's an enormous infusion of very powerful sort of solutions and technologies into the Indian growth dynamics, you know, I think you can think of India as peaking, you know, at least a decade later, maybe more. And there's other examples of that, but I just pick India because it's the biggest. It's one of the 6 largest emitters in the world already. And that's a function of its growth. If you look, this may not make sense to you, but if you're thinking about, you know, how many people do you have to get to agree on something in order to make progress, I always have a tendency to start with, well, who are the major players? And can they get something done without, you know, dealing with the other 170, in this case, countries in the world? And so I just did this calculation based on published data, and it may be slightly wrong, but it's, or you know, the orders of magnitude are right. So China's the biggest emitter, everybody knows that. The US and Europe all in are similar. They're putting Canada just to add it to North America. And Mexico, but that's not fair. Mexico's kind of in a different category here. It's a middle-income country, but India is now pretty big. Japan is big enough still to make the list. And so when you add up these, you know, and I probably should have put in Russia, but anyway, one way or another, what this little graph tells you is that just these 6 alone, and I know Europe's not a country, but I mean, but for this purpose, it can probably act a little bit like a single entity. You've got over 70% of global emissions. So that has 2 implications. One, if they actually do something, they can make a pretty big dent in the problem. Second, it's a lot easier to come to some kind of, it's not easy, but it's easier to come to some kind of agreement if you're dealing with the kind of major players. And 2, if they solve that problem, or if we collectively, with your help, solve that problem, then part of the solution will be to generate technologies and other things that help bring the other 30% along. To me, that makes it seem less hopeless, because when I see 25,000 people show up in, you know, in Glasgow, or however many it was, you know, and 180 countries with different stages of development agendas, and, you know, going this way and that. I mean, it's hard enough with just this group. I mean, the Indians are terrified, you know, by phasing out, you know, fossil fuels, you know, excessively quickly, because they think it might cut off, you know, so they get pounded, you know, in the kind of global press for changing the wording to phase down from phase out. Directionally, we're moving in the right direction. So the advanced countries' commitments on net zero are sort of 2050, maybe in Europe 2040. China's at 2060, and India is at 2070. In terms of, you know, where they are in the development cycle and how much growth they have to come, I mean, this isn't very precise, but it's sort of moving in the direction you would expect, a kind of reasonable set of commitments and agreements. This is just meant to, this is probably something you already know, but I did the following calculation. I said, okay, I've been talking a lot about the growth of the global economy and why this, what this mountain is we have to climb. If the global economy grows at 3% in real terms, and if we want over about a 30-year period to be down in the neighborhood of, you know, 14 billion tons or something like that. I know these numbers are arbitrary, but directionally it's kind of probably right. Then the carbon intensity of the global economy, measured exactly as you would measure it, you know, CO2 per, pick any currency you want, euro of global GDP has to decline by 7% a year. And that's a big, big hurdle. It doesn't happen to do it every single year, but you can't keep deferring it without running out of the carbon budget that is much talked about. And the estimates that I see, if you put it in financial terms, are that that this will take somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion of investment per year globally to get the job done. And that nobody knows, but I think a reasonable guess is that that's complementary public and private sector investment, and maybe it's about 50-50. I don't think this is out of reach, actually, given the size and wealth of the global economy, but getting it all to the right places is a big challenge. So again, to revert to the lower income countries and their growth patterns, you know, if you want this kind of investment to occur there, you can't just leave them alone and do it. So I think the intense discussions of the cross-border aspects of the financing of all this are actually critically important, or we won't have everybody in the game. So, I mean, you have a better sense than this, so I'll just kind of finish up by talking about a little bit about this. I think that there's a lot of very interesting work on mechanisms. You know, I used to kind of work on pricing. And pricing actually worked pretty well with sulfur dioxide and whatnot. Ozone was handled well, but with a different, you know, set of, they were just direct, we're not going to do it anymore, sort of agreements. I guess carbon's a much harder problem in the sense of getting it done in such a way. I mean, you could, in principle, create a global carbon trading mechanism. But if you sort of think about how you go about doing that, if in order to do it, you have to allocate the declining credits in the, I mean, we sit around and argue for a long time and agree on the time path, for sort of total carbon emissions. We presume we can monitor and measure and regulate this thing. And then we have to allocate these credits, that then gets bought and sold so that mitigation occurs in an efficient fashion, and carbon gets priced and all the good things that come with that, including incentives. But then the question is, how do we allocate those things? So, a crude version of fairness, you would allocate them on a per capita basis. Problem with that is it means that the developed countries are going to have to spend a massive amount of money to buy those things, depending on what the price is, and there will be a massive transfer of income to the developing world that has very low per capita emissions and doesn't need the credits. They're going to be allocated for a while. So that turns out to be a non-starter, right? So then you think, well, maybe we better start closer to the starting point, so that these transfers aren't so big. And that makes some sense. But that's a really hard problem, right? And it can tell you solve that problem. It's very hard to see how you have a global carbon trading system, despite its very attractive kind of characteristics. If you don't have a global carbon trading system, then you have these carbon, I think we're going to get them, carbon border adjustment taxes of a variety of kinds, because this is especially important in Europe, because if you get too far out ahead, you can be really hurt fairly badly if other people are sort of free riding or lagging. And so it's a nice idea. I think it's very hard to implement, right? I mean, nothing's easy to implement, but this one's really hard. So you imagine, pick up any product that was produced. I'll pick the classic example we use to describe the complexity of global supply chains. an iPhone. Chips manufactured in probably 3 countries. Displays manufactured in a couple other countries. Parts shipped to China, assembled in China, shipped, with varying degrees of, dirty, meaning carbon intensive shipping lines to various parts of the world, or in airplanes, which aren't great either. And then they cross the border. What's the right carbon adjustment tax to apply to that? If you suspect that somewhere out there in that network, they weren't paying enough attention to carbon. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a pretty complex thing, to actually do. Now, so I think what's going to happen is they're going to take kind of the big, carbon intensive stuff like steel, like aluminum, depending where the electricity came from, cement. Cement doesn't tend to get shipped around the world. It's so bloody heavy, but things like that, and focus on the kind of big sources is a good start. Anyway, I don't mean to dismiss the idea, but probably we're going to have to make do with good enough and not kind of perfect. I've already mentioned the measurement era. An interesting idea that I heard Michael Kramer talking about is a reflection of what we did with vaccines. And he's been a proponent of this in that area. And the idea is if you really want to accelerate this process, you need government to fund multiple high-risk things, many of which will fail, right? That's what we did with vaccines, basically. The government stepped in and they said, in this circumstance, we can't afford to sit around and wait. And so we are going to directly, not solely, but directly subsidize and fund multiple, not only vaccine development programs, but manufacturing facilities for them. So they were funding, this is the US government, Europe to some extent, they were funding building manufacturing facilities for vaccines that might not work. And that's one of the reasons, and you might say, well, why would you do that? And the answer is because it stands up to a benefit cost calculation, right? The cost of not having those vaccines was so high that they figured we better, do this. It looks, kind of silly at some level, but and so I think this is it's not a new idea, but it's an important idea. We now, if you think we're somewhere near midnight and we've been stalling around for a while, we may need something that's quite extraordinary and abnormal in terms of development. And it's not, and I think the vaccine analogy is kind of useful. There's a lot of talk. I just wrote DARPA. DARPA, yeah, I think most of you know already. The DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It's somewhat well known because it gave us the internet and semiconductors, among other things. It was developed to build technologies rapidly, not for the economy, but for defense, right? Why did they get into semiconductors? Because vacuum tubes don't work very well in space or on fighter aircraft. Just turned out to have enormously positive benefits kind of in the rest of the economy. And then there's various versions of this being created. Jean Tirole and Olivier Blanchard just wrote something that I'm going to read as soon as I get a minute that suggests we should have a version of the sort of environmental, meaning, climate change version of DARPA called ARPA or ARPA-E in Europe, again, to accelerate the technology side. So I think my bottom line here is people are thinking outside the box, and it's actually, I'm not saying that everything is a good idea, and there's, important work to be done on implementation about what version of these things work, I think. But they're interesting ideas, and because of the urgency of the problem, I think important. And they help take us past the point of saying we need rapid technology development and then stop, right? It sort of starts to suggest, you know, well, what's the public sector's role? How do you get it? How do you get there? I think the notion that there is a public sector role in sort of, you know, creating economic and investment conditions that accelerate this is uncontroversial at this point. I guess I've already talked about under the heading of carbon trading, but maybe broader than that. If you think if you've got this carbon budget for the economy and people agree that's sort of sensible and maybe even achievable, you still have to divide it up, and that's just hard. The last thing I'll say is something that you may not agree with, but I think, you know, the challenge of getting engagement and commitment has been so great that I think we've gone overboard on green on the one hand and all the things that go with it, including energy efficiency and maybe carbon reduction and all that, and negative on fossil fuels. So I'll just say it flat out. We're in a multi-decade transition, right? And in that transition, the green side is going to become more important and the dirty fossil fuel side is going to become less important. But those two aspects of this complex transition have to match. So the notion that we can accomplish this over, say, 4 or 5 decades by stopping investing in fossil fuels is just nonsense, right? Do we really want to not invest in natural gas as this part of the transition that would supplant some kind of coal? Just because, you know. So I think we're, you know, on the back, it's like a pendulum, right? You know, because it's sort of public opinion. So we started here, you know, with nobody paying attention. I don't mean no, but certainly in the developing world, you know, even 15 years ago, if you said climate change, they'd say, what? So we got way past that, and that's good. And now I think, you know, we've got to the point where there's lots of interest groups and pressure groups saying, you know, in the investment world, in the university endowments, you know, demonstrations, no more investment in fossil fuels. Well, if the argument is we shouldn't subsidize fossil fuels, I'm all on board. It's a disastrous policy that, you know, everybody should get rid of as rapidly as possible. Heck, I chaired a commission, you know, more than 13 years ago that said this, and everybody agreed then. And that was long before we got to this point. I did have some interesting conversations with political leaders about that. I remember the president of Indonesia, he said, you know, I know exactly what you're saying and you're absolutely right, but it's not so easy to get rid of these subsidies. He said, we'll get it done, but it's going to take some time because of the distributional implications of kind of withdrawing it quickly. So you have to be kind of sensitive and tolerant of that kind of thing. But on the principle itself, there's absolutely no question. But what I'm talking about is different, which is, you know, we do, you know, the people in the energy field, some of them are, you know, still in the mode of defending their industry against this, you know, long-term transition we have to enter. But most of them, or not most, a significant number come around and understand this. But when they say, you know, we can't phase out fossil fuels overnight, they're right. We're going to have to live with them, you know, for a fairly extended period. And if we have, you know, in some kinds of transportation, we may have to live with them and take the carbon out of the atmosphere in different ways. Anyway, I don't mean this to be a hobby horse, but I do think we have to be pretty careful, because the consequence of getting this wrong is major economic disruptions. And if you have enough of them, then the intangible asset, which is the commitment of people to the whole enterprise, will start to sort of depreciate. And that you don't want, right? That you definitely don't want. And if you think this is theoretical, I'll just close with this. I think the Chinese government got out over its skis on the sort of greening of the economy. And so they basically gave the orders to the various local governments to do this, and now they have electricity shortages. And so what did the local governments do? Because they always do what the center says. They basically, got in touch with all the companies and said, 1 day a week, you're not going to have electricity. You pick the day. No, that's not the right way to handle this, right? So that it's just a simple example. But I mean, I think there's some, I think those of you who are kind of at the core of thinking through how to get this done in all of its complex multiple dimensions, it's worthwhile emphasizing that in this transition, we have to, some mechanisms and a mindset that helps us do it in the least disruptive way possible. And that I tried to capture in the notion of balance. So why don't I stop there?
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your. Okay, so we have so I take some questions. No, so I have a lot I have to say, but we can speak also later. I also prefer to leave the floor also to the researcher in FEEM, and that is also our values. They are their research. Only one quick question,
Sure.
But it's not exactly on energy, but is in your introduction, so inflation.
Yes.
So in my view, if inflation is increasing a lot, this can have a cascade effect on the whole transition in the future, because now transition is pushed a lot by a big debt. Every time there is a crisis, the reaction from a monetary point of view is an increase of money supply for all the banks, and so there is this kind of, my point of view is a scale effect. No, if I increase money, increase in another country, so there is a scale effect. It's changing, increasing a lot the quantity of money that is moving, is creating money that can create opportunities, but also some damages. Also, if there is a possible increase of inflation, possible increase on interest rate, debt, and so we can have also an impact on, in my view, on the possible investment for the future.
I agree with that. I mean, yeah, that's a good argument. First of all, there's a somewhat dangerous view out there that there really isn't any limit to the public debt because we can have these low interest rates forever. And the way we accomplish that is the central bank just keeps buying the debt or, absorbing it. It's an intermediary, but, and that's just not right. I mean, in the end, Raghuram Rajan was asked the question, when does this end? And he says, it ends when the people who are supposed to be extending the credit don't think they're going to get paid back. So so there is a limit to this, and I think we can set aside that argument. That means that as debt rises, your investment capacity diminishes, and your capacity to absorb shocks diminishes, and the risk of instability in the financial system also increases, and they're all kind of serious problems. So we don't want to be flippant about this. On the inflation issue itself, Sergio, I mean, there's kind of three ways to get rid of a debt overhang, right? One of them, John Tirole calls the Italian way, which is run primary surpluses. The trouble with that is that's a painful and B, a growth killing strategy. The second one is, restructure the debt, which means default. That's not a very interesting, well, it happens all the time, but in the developing world, or it used to. But that's not very interesting. And the third one's inflation. Inflation reduces the real, liability, but essentially by penalizing the holders of a security that doesn't change in nominal value when the inflation rises. And so if you want to get rid of the debt overhang fairly fast, you might like to have a little bit of a, not out of control, but above normal inflation. And there are people who kind of think that. The problem is it does have some negative distributional consequences, pensions. I mean, the reason we got rid of inflation in the first place is, in the 1980s mainly, and following. There were reasons for that. So there's not a lot of comfortable choices, but I think you're right. My best guess is the central banks are going to, meaning the Fed and the ECB prominently, are going to let inflation run a bit. They're going to say, well, basically, we're making up for being below target for, God knows how many years, 10 or more, since the great financial crisis anyway. And then, and hopefully we'll have enough of a robust recovery, and the growth engines will be running fast enough that, we'll take care of it. I mean, if, the people who want to put this in technical terms say, the question really is the growth rate going to be above the interest rate? If the growth rate's above the interest rate, then basically the debt over lengthy periods of time takes care of itself. The historical experience is the debt runs way up in times of crisis or shock. So wars, pandemic in this case, and then comes down. So there's kind of a reasonable chance, but I think the uncomfortable position the central banks are in is that they have kind of by culture have learned to be so serious about inflation that, so they kind of dismiss this as transitory, and that it's not as transitory as we thought. I'm not terribly worried about embedding inflationary expectations, unless it goes on for an awfully long time in the developed economies. I don't I guess I know America a bit better, but boy, the underpinnings of kind of wage price spirals, like powerful unions, indexed, contracts and stuff, they're all gone. They're just not there anymore. So this is just supply and demand imbalances. I don't see those other things coming back. I think the risk in Latin America is higher for reasons having to do with different institutional structures. But that's kind of, separate subject. But so I think it's not the same everywhere, this risk. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So now if there is someone with some question, I know that Ilenia has some question from the...
Oh, from outside?
Yeah, I have one question from myself, if I may, and then there's a couple of questions from the audience. I don't know, Sergio, sorry, in terms of timing, shall we have like 15 minutes more? Is it okay? Perfect.
Fine with me.
Is it okay? Perfect. Thanks,
I mean,
Professor.
they have work to do, but I'm unemployed, so.
No, but this is work as well, no? Is intensive learning. Okay, so the first question, which is mine, I was thinking about the digital transformation.
Yep. So
you mentioned artificial intelligence and cloud computing as such, and I cannot even imagine the amount of data and information that this technology require and produce as well.
Right.
And I mean, information is certainly a resource. Like there's an article saying data is the new oil, and I pretty agree with that. But it also has some costs, and I'm thinking about privacy costs, for example. Like, what is the effect of this cost in your opinion? Can we think of having a future in which privacy will have like a proper economic value? And so that was mine. I don't know if you want to gather a couple of more other questions and then answer together, or we do one by one. Up to you.
No, go ahead. Yeah,
okay.
Let's list them and then.
Perfect. Okay, so so this is from the public. In terms of the energy transition, one of the transformation which you have explained, I was thinking about the fact that different states have different growth paths and rates, which certainly translates in different polluting level. The environmental Kasnet curve teaches us something about this. How can different actors work together for the same goal, which is in my mind the net zero emissions scenario? Then number 3, which is again about the digital one. So digital transformation in the context of data-driven services is facing the challenge of sustainability. what do you think could be the impact that the increasing consumer demand for privacy will have on business? Will business take this challenge as an opportunity to increase competitiveness, or is it just going to be a matter of policymakers and legal compliance? Thank you. Okay, so it's a little bit connected with mine. I think for the moment we can stop with this.
Okay,
Thank you.
that's great. Thank you, Elaine. So the first question, which is yours, is just a core issue. There's a lot of writing about this. I don't think we have, fully developed answers. I think there's a pretty clear sense that some of the answers won't work. So data is enormously valuable because of, and it is created in mountainous, but virtually all information is in digital form now. That's new, like last 30, 40 years. It's the digital age. It's the kind of core underpinning of all this. So that's point one. Point two, it's enormously valuable because it is the, oil, it's the fuel for the artificial intelligence, whatever version it takes. And those things are valuable. I mean, it was an experiment conducted in the e-commerce world in China, where they basically divided up the users of the platform and they turned off the recommendation engine for one set and left it on for the others and compared them. So it was a kind of controlled experiment. So we know how it works for the ones where they left it on. When they turned it off, transactions fell. People, couldn't find anything interesting. And what was recommended, what was coming through, because it had nothing to do with who you were or anything else you can infer from the data, was the kind of top 500 products by market share, regardless of whether you had any interest in them at all, and most people didn't. And who did that hurt? It hurt the niche, smaller businesses that were serving, a market where the technology could help the people who were interested find them, because they couldn't find them anymore. So they decided, well, that's pretty impressive. A, we learned a lot, and B, there are real consequences. Data is not valuable when maintained in silos. For the most part, it has to be properly and carefully and responsibly pooled and shared in order to generate the benefits, right? So think of, a highly sensitive area like health data. Some of it is just, it's useful if you have multiple suppliers of services that they kind of know the same stuff. So you don't have to kind of go around and be 16 different people, all of them imperfectly informed about who you are. Now we're getting pretty close to that. It's worse in the United States because of the decentralized character. I think, in Italy, where you have a very well-built, publicly funded health system, you probably don't have that. But when you get to the point of saying, of using the data, in detection of diseases and stuff like that, then you have to pool it. For example, this is meant to be illustrative. 2 young people at Stanford decided they would see if you could use image recognition to detect skin cancer. And they went to the dermatologist and said, can we give it a try? And they said yes. And they worked hard and produced about 100,000 images. That was the training data set for the algorithms. And they, basically trained them to detect about 8 or 10 different kinds of skin cancer. And it worked pretty well. I don't think anybody in this room who's, worried about this kind of thing would not go to their dermatologist. And, this doesn't do biopsies and take out, basal cell carcinomas. But it was kind of impressive. And, 85% of the world's population doesn't live anywhere near a dermatologist. So if you, and your phone has a camera. You can ship the images, and the algorithm looks at them, and if you actually have something that looks a little risky, then maybe you will get on the bus and go 85 kilometers to an urban center to get checked out. The alternative is you won't, and you're just missing that aspect of preventive primary care. And that story gets told over and over again. And in order to do that, you have to pool the data. You can anonymize it, but you have to pool. You can't do it by kind of one-off. So I think that's the starting point. So I think where that leads us is we have to define carefully, and I think Europe has, again, made major progress in this, define carefully what is the responsible use of data and whose rights need to be respected. You know, like the right to be forgotten, however you do that technologically, the right to know, where your data is going to go, the right to be able to veto virtually any transfer of data from one entity to another. Trust is a very important part of this. There's studies of this. People aren't stupid. I mean, they sound stupid because what they say and what they do is different. This is called the privacy paradox. So everybody says, I'm very worried about privacy, and then clicks accept all, routinely. We all do it. I mean, this is a bore, in part because the disclosures are all different. So you actually have to read them. There may come a time when it's all standardized, and then you say, oh, I know this one. Yeah, it's okay. But that's not true now. They're all making up their own, maybe on purpose, so you won't read it. So I think that's the road we're going down. But people understand that that the data is valuable. It's the other version of the new collateral. The new oil is this in the finance area. It's the new collateral, right? It's the thing I talked about before. But they're both kind of the right ideas. And maybe we'll have this in legislation, and maybe we'll have it in business practices under the ESG umbrella. I think the other issue that has to do with data is it's not just, by the way, there's a huge security problem with data. I mean, there are major breaches, on a routine basis. You tend to forget because you read one and then 2 weeks later there's another one. But when you go and look at, Wikipedia, at how many there've been and how big they are, it's just stunning. So there's a whole separate issue about, regardless of people's intentions, rights, responsibilities, legal obligations, and so on, is just whether the data is secure. And if it's not, who's going to get it? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it a hacker? Is it, I mean, it's really important. So if you look at Facebook, Facebook's business model is basically getting your attention, engagement, and then selling it to advertisers along with the algorithms that tell them who you are. And how do you get engagement? You make people mad, angry. So that's a pretty destructive business model, right? So then you ask yourself the question, Jesus, is there another one? Maybe we could have subscriptions that paid for our social media platform that allowed us to talk to family and friends and send pictures back and forth. I know we're oversimplifying it, but this is really the alignment between that business model and any reasonable guess at what are kind of social and political objectives, including not polarizing the society. That alignment's very bad. I don't know how it's going to go away. Maybe they'll just shut it down. But anyway, we're now straying into sort of territory that, there's a huge array of regulatory issues with respect to the digital technologies. And front and center are the privacy ones, but there's monopoly power, who gets to use the data, etc. Yeah.
The audience online is not connected.
What could be the role of antitrust in this technological transformation? Because I think that right now we are so fond of unicorns that sometimes we forget the competition part of and the innovative competition.
Right. No, it's a very good question. I think competition policy or what we call antitrust in America is crucial, because these especially the platforms are market access gateways, and they can misuse that. And there's considerable evidence that that has actually happened virtually everywhere, but prominently because they tend to be based in China and the United States, although they operate all over the place. They have, in fact, done things that you would view as restricting access to the market, and they're being, depending on the regime. I mean, how they go about this in China is a little bit different, but basically, for example, they told Alibaba that they could not require people to use Alipay, which is the, really on the thing. They could use WeChat Pay or anything else they want. So they're kind of, they're breaking down so you can see what's going on is that once a platform has enough power, then they kind of control who gets to play on it. And what they're saying is, no, you don't, right? You got to let, competent players, even if they're not part of your little ecosystem, become part of it. And so that's really important. I mean, we're going to go down that route. Whether we have to break them up, I don't know. I mean, these are complicated entities to regulate, even from a competition policy point of view, because they're two-sided markets, as John Tirole keeps reminding us. And on one side, they're giving a whole lot of stuff away. So if you think those are the consumers, meaning the users of the platform, it's kind of hard to argue that they're being damaged. I mean, you might have social consequences you view as damaging, but you can't, it just doesn't make sense. On the other hand, on the other side, if they're blocking people who, who could become part of the technological landscape, then you've got them. But that requires a shift, exactly as you said, from focusing on the consumer, where I think, at least in America, we were overly focused on. In America, we had a period in antitrust where if you couldn't prove that the consumers, however defined, were being hurt, then there wasn't much you could do about it. But I think the argument now is, we need to shift the balance, not away from consumers, but a little bit more toward, are they suppressing competition and eventually technological advancement? And I think the answer is yes. So we're going to have more of it. I mean, we've entered the era of regulation of these things. We finished with the era of unregulated. So that's permanent shift, and it's good. But we don't really completely know how to do it yet, I think is where we are. On the energy transition, yes, I think it's crucial for actors to work together. They asked the students at Bocconi last night in this session we had, with John Tirole and Michael Kramer and me, whose job is it to deal with the energy transition, with climate change? And the majority answer was government. The other alternatives were companies and me, meaning us. Companies got some credit, but the response to that on our part was, I think, the same response you all as experts would give, which is all of the above, right? I mean, I don't think anybody thinks, you can write the government out of the script. You probably want to struggle to get a price on carbon, and or other equivalent like regulatory policies. On the other hand, you don't want the corporate sector off, on doing their own thing. I mean, some version of ESG, or what we call a multi-stakeholder model, is important, and corporate engagement is important, because a lot of this is going to be bottom up, right? The innovation and whatnot, whether it's climate change strictly or the circular economy. I just personally don't see how the government can do it. So it's in a sense, it's a collaboration, right? What you're striving for is kind of everybody on board. Innovation at big and small scales, rapid diffusion of really interesting or useful new ideas. Government, you know, has an important role in multiple dimensions. It's not just pricing. I mean, they can subsidize and or accelerate the process greatly, and we have examples of that, of the type we talked about before. No, there was just one other question, I think, about sustainability and business models. Could you read that last question again, Eleni?
Okay, so digital transformation in the context of data-driven services is facing the challenge of sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think could be the impact that the increase in consumer demand for privacy will have on business? Will business take this challenge as an opportunity to increase competitiveness, or is it just going to be a matter of policymakers and legal compliance? Thank you.
Okay. I think we partly covered that. I mean, in the sense that, no, you can't let the companies decide. You know, the regulatory things are really important. Even if a lot of companies are responsible, there'll be outliers and you have to get rid of them. There'll also be experiments that, you know, maybe should occur, but then need to be truncated because they're not working. So I'll give an example of that. The peer-to-peer lending in China was a fiasco. I mean, there was so much fraud and whatnot that they just basically shut the whole thing down. Should they have let the market-based technological market-based experiment occur in the first place? That's hard to know. If you knew that it was going to be shot through with kind of problems like that, you probably wouldn't even allow it to start. Look, in terms of sustainability, I think digital is a kind of important part of the solution, but you have to recognize the fact that if we're going to operate in a digital economy, we're going to have very, very big data centers, and they're going to consume a lot of electricity, and hopefully less because of the semiconductor, you know, progress that we've talked about, less than they might have if we were doing it 10 years ago. The thing I like the least is, you know, Bitcoin, because I think it's useless. It's not a currency. Now, I'm going to say something outrageous on purpose. It's not a currency. It's an asset class. I don't get why anybody invests in it. It's highly volatile. You can invest your savings in there and have them go down by a factor of, you know, 2.5 overnight. And people go mining for these Bitcoins and use up an astronomical amounts of computing power and electricity. Stanford University banned Bitcoin mining because it was starting to overload the computer systems and electricity supply system in the university. There's, you know, a bunch of very smart students who thought it'd be fun to go Bitcoin mining. So you get a few hundred of them doing this and you've got a major problem. I mean, if there were real benefits from it, that at least, look, I'm out of bounds. I mean, there's lots of people who think it's more interesting than this. We will have digital currencies, but there'll be we're going to have digital currencies because we're going to live in a digital world, you know, where we pay for things with a thing in our pocket and QR codes and other things like that. And the central bank's going to keep control of them, and they're going to have a digital, you know, fiat currency that's like the currency we have now. It's just a logical extension of where we're going, but that's not radical, and that's not necessarily blockchain based. And the final thing, just to protect myself, is I don't like Bitcoin, but blockchain is a really interesting technology for a lot of different reasons, including that in principle, it's capable of producing an almost unalterable record of what has happened. And so in supply chains, if you really want to know who has handled this product, where it's been, you know, as it goes through this complex chain to get from where it starts to the final market, blockchain is looking like a very promising way to handle those transactions. And maybe they'll be used in secure cross-border transactions between central banks, maybe even other people, you know, as long as it isn't in excessively high volume, right? So that you get ridiculous consumption of kind of databases with, you know, huge long pieces of blockchain. but it's a useful technology. So this is another area where we're kind of fumbling along, and I'm probably an outlier. Now, I'm not a complete outlier. I mean, there's a lot of people who think this is sort of the cryptocurrencies are sort of nonsense. You know where this came from, right? I mean, there's a significant group of people who have different names in different countries. We call them libertarians. They don't like anything that's a centralized authority. They think the way to run society is to limit that to the maximum extent possible. They're called libertarians because basically that leaves everything else open. There's a fair number of people in that category, and one of the things they'd like to do is eliminate the role of the government and the central bank in commerce, in money, in transactions. And so they thought, well, a blockchain-based thing that they don't have anything to do with is a great way to do it. I don't know, more power to them, but I don't think it'll work. It's the bottom line. So I mean, hopefully that kind of covers the issues. I mean, there are some challenges in moving to the digital world that relate to sustainability. There's also some fairly big opportunities. I mean, I'll finish with the last one, maybe, Sergio. You know, I think one of the things that will emerge from the pandemic is we will have hybrid models for almost everything. You know, we won't, in universities where I have lived and worked, we'll go back to the classroom, but we'll do much, much better bringing other resources in. These are complements rather than substitutes for each other. I think you will find that companies that operate globally, you know, that used to fly people around at enormous environmental cost, will do it less because they don't have to. They have to do some of it because you can't build relationships, you know, ab initio, you know, on a screen. It's just, that's kind of the way we're put together. But you can maintain them and you can do business. And with the tools for doing that are now just better and better because they accelerated in terms of quality and we had to do that. So I think this is all good. And when you add them all up, they're not the whole solution, but they're a significant contribution to it. So I think that's and these and as agenda items that may be linked. I mean, in other words, companies that are multinational that are serious about this will say part of our ESG commitments will be to reduce our carbon footprint, and a pretty good way to do it is to use digital more and airplanes less. And by the way, we'll sell the 3 airplanes we own that have 3 people on flying around. Do you ever see the carbon footprint for the very wealthy? I saw a report of somebody, I don't know how the hell they did this calculation, but they did a calculation and the average CO2 emissions for, this is gross before they kind of bought offsets, okay? For people, you know, the types of people who have yachts, that's great, right? Pushing all that water out of the way. And airplanes was, I think it was 80 tons a person. I mean, just off the chart. So we probably don't want a whole lot of that, even though, you know, there probably aren't enough of them to make a difference. Do you all know? Never mind. We'll talk about it later. I was thinking about ocean shipping. How, I mean, that's kind of that. That's a pretty important source. I think we need to kind of clean that up, and I don't have a very good sense of how to do it. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor
everybody.
Spence. Yeah, to Spencer, Professor Spence, to be here. I hope this will be one of the first, maybe also for the right? Not the last, also for the future. So the door of FEEM is open, so it's possible to collaborate also because we are here together. So I thank everybody, and so we keep going on. Okay, thank you very much also to the participants online. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.